Welcome to the Nightly 5 podcast with Belle Taylor.
Unless there is some kind of profound threat against Australia, I see it very difficult to see a national service model coming back. But I think, the least we can do is be prepared for it. I mean, otherwise we're going to be surprised. And frankly, we'll probably be just as bad, if not worse, than the Russians in September 2022.
Those are the words of retired Australian Army Major General Mick Ryan. He's speaking on his podcast, Burke and Ryan, which looks at national security and modern conflict. Ryan believes we need to bring back national service, claiming that the current all-voluntary model of service is inadequate to deter Chinese aggression. Joining me now is the other host of that podcast, Latika Burke. Latika, thanks for joining me today. Do you think conscription in Australia is something even remotely possible in 2024?
Not in 2024, but I do think a debate about it is something that is possible. And actually what I said in that podcast, and I strongly believe, is that if this were to ever have any traction in Australian society, which I believe if you went to the public right now and said, do you support some form of national service, most people would probably say no. If we were to be in a situation where we needed national service and had to get that through to the community, we would need to do that on a bipartisan basis. There is absolutely no way in the current climate that if you just had, say, for instance, the coalition, which is not their policy at the moment, proposing or supporting this, and you had a position where the Labor Party said, no way, Jose, which is their policy at the moment, it would be like the Republic or the Voice referendum. You just wouldn't see support across the community. So I don't think that this is something that will be supported today, right here now, tomorrow. But in the future, if things were to deteriorate in the geopolitical situation further, which is very likely and most experts believe will happen, I do think there could be a time where we see a conversation at least open up about it.
You do this podcast on modern conflict. I don't think you need to be a military strategist to do a couple of sums on the back of an envelope and look at a country like China that has a population of 1.4 billion people, with Australia at about 26 million people. And a lot of people are going to say, why would we mobilise our people? Surely if we're going to be talking to China, the way to do it isn't boots on the ground. The way to do it is talking and figuring out some other way.
Yeah, absolutely. Nobody wants to see that sort of situation. That would literally be worst case scenario. And the point that Mick Ryan, who is a military strategist, unlike you and me, is that he makes the point that if we show strength now, you avoid that whole situation, because the whole point of deterrence is not to build yourself up to a position where you want to go to war, but it's preparing yourself to say, look, don't even try us. We're ready. And the cost of you attempting something is actually such a risk and is so great to you that it's not worth you trying. You just stay in your lane, we'll stay in ours. That's the whole point of the comments he is making. Yeah. He does not say that we need some form of national service because we're about to go to war. That's absolutely not what he's saying. What he is saying is that at the moment, the armed forces is shrinking. We're struggling to retain and recruit people. And by the way, this is not an Australia-only problem. This is hugely reflective of debates in modern society in France, across Europe, in the UK where I live. This is the exact same debate that's taking place. And some of those countries actually have gone on to reintroduce or introduce or expand existing national service schemes. So, for example, in Denmark, they've just opened it up to be gender neutral, which means women will now be asked to come and train.
Yeah, Denmark have had national service for a long time, and so have many countries in Europe.
Right.
But you just mentioned the UK there, and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has announced that he will bring back national service for 18-year-olds if re-elected. Why is that? You're in the UK. Why is this idea suddenly in vogue over there?
Look, the broader conscription debate has been bubbling away pretty much since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because that war has not been nipped in the bud as early as people might have liked, or as people who could have made a difference behaved in a way that could have stopped that war in its first year. Instead, it's dragged on, and now we're seeing a long war in continental Europe. And Russia has really re-geared its entire society, including through mobilization, but also economically, to sustain that war long term. So now you're seeing various leaders in Europe say, oh, hang on, this war could easily come at us. And the starting point for that are some of those former Soviet-occupied countries like Estonia, Lithuania. And those countries are the ones that have national service because they have never seen the threats to them go away. Now, Australia is a very isolated country and doesn't think conflict's going to come to it, but it very well could because we're in a very, very fragile situation. And so in Europe, this conversation has been bubbling along and now it's been taken up by the UK. But personally, I think this is an election stunt. And I think it's been misfired, and I think it's a big mistake from Rishi Sunak to lob this out in an election campaign, because if you really were serious about the need for this, you would do it in a way that was divorced from an election campaign. You would depoliticize it, and you would actually go to everybody in the society at the civic level, amongst your political opponents. You'd go to the military and say, how do we make the case all together for what we now deem is such a critical, pressing need, that we can now go to the community and say, look, we need you to buy in on this a little bit more.
You certainly can't imagine it being particularly popular with, parents of teenagers who might have to do this, or people who've just turned 18. That, it's not going to be something that those people would probably be putting their hands up for.
Well, actually, it is fairly popular amongst adults, and you can kind of see where that might kick in. There's a bit of, these kids today, They don't know what...
Okay, maybe I'm projecting there. I don't know what the UK's like.
The older you get, the more they support it. And don't forget that, they do have a continental war in Europe in their generational memory. Yeah. And of course, Australians went to fight to support Europe as well. But obviously, it's a lot closer to home in Britain. And as someone who lives in Britain, they talk about the war all the time. Okay. It ran right through their pandemic response, we're the country that beat continental Europe at its own game here. We can do anything if we just believe in ourselves. So there is a bit of I think sometimes misguided British boosterism in the society. And that does reflect, I think, here where you do see strong support for this in older generations. Younger generations, I actually think there might be an opportunity for them to buy in, because this is not completely about military service. If you look very closely at some of these schemes, it can involve, for example, weekend service, like delivering medicines to people who can't go and get them themselves. It might involve things like joining the emergency services. So in Australia, that could be like the SES, or helping learn how to fight bushfires, or clean up after floods. And actually, if you saw during the pandemic, when the country was in crisis, a lot of people did actually want to help. And that same sentiment exists in Britain. I think it is current in Australia. And I do think you would see a lot of people go, yeah, I could probably give something to my community if I was shown the way that I could do it and be helpful and not be wasting anyone's time. So I'm not sure that the door is entirely closed for younger generations either.
Okay, this is really interesting thoughts. Thank you so much, Latika, and we look forward to chatting to you again soon.
It's my pleasure.